In the early week, the issue of school funding hit the headlines again. Now, this time it was Canberra's $1.2 billion Choice and Affordability Fund. Basically, it's a big pot of money from the federal government designed to help non-government schools transition to a new funding model. And naturally, a bunch of people aren't happy about it. Well, if Canberra throw a few bucks to the Catholics, the independents and the state schools say, what about me? If they shovel more coin to the public schools, well, the private schools cry poor. And look, no matter how much money the feds toss into the education pot, the states always beg for more to prop their schools up. So if you ask me, the funding wars have to come to an end. And just hurtling more money into the mix, well, that obviously isn't the answer. That's been proved. So here's an idea to consider at least. Let the states fund their schools how they want. After all, state schools should be a state responsibility. Let independent schools continue to raise money via fees as they've always done. And if Canberra insists on remaining involved in the messy business of school funding models, then why don't they simplify and depoliticise the whole thing? Now, simply send a voucher worth X dollars for each primary school child, or a voucher worth Y dollars for every secondary school child to the parents. The parents can then take the voucher to whatever school they choose to educate their child and hand it over at enrolment. I mean, overall, Canberra's role in education has to be pared right back from what's actually taught in the classroom to how the classrooms are funded. And moving to a less convoluted, confusing and criticised financial model, I think, would be a good first step in the process of retreat. All right, well, I'm sure everyone has a point of view. Now, Sam, you've been involved in politics on and off forever. What do you make of it?
Well, I'm not entirely sure that the Australian people are keen for the federal government to retreat from the education sector on the whole. I mean, Canada doesn't have a federal education minister. I could not imagine a Liberal or Labor government ever standing up and saying, you know what, we don't want to have an education minister. So politically, there's some hairs on it. The other hair is when you talk about we'll have X dollars and Y dollars, well, there's a difference between equality and egalitarianism, or equal money and equality. So if you give every kid in Australia, say, $100 to go to school to take off their school fees, that sounds fine on the face of it. But when you think through it, a kid in Mount Druitt is going to have a very different school than a kid in Coogee. Or a kid in Brunswick is going to have a very different school to anywhere else. So you need, and that's what the Gonski model holds. It holds that each area is different, and the socio-demographic area needs to have some form of accounting in that model.
I don't disagree with that at all, but I mean, what I was saying in the piece was we've got to look at Canberra's role. I mean, obviously what a lot of people overlook here is that state education should be, and constitutionally is, the role of the states. But increasingly Canberra have gobbled into that arena, as they've done with everything. And
their tentacles are getting bigger and bigger, aren't they? I mean, like a lot of issues in Australia, we're very good at spending huge amounts of money, but not so good at getting great outcomes. Now, some of the history of this, Sam, as you'll know, there's a historical agreement with the Catholic schools. So they've gobbled up a lot of money, and that's most of the federal funding goes to a lot of the independent schools, be it Catholic or the other private schools. So they have a historical agreement from the 70s where there were sort of unique circumstances then, but they've sort of kept up this sort of funding kind of pie, which is part of the arguably injustice of the funding.
So the unique circumstances there was that the federal government wasn't funding any Catholic schools. They had no funding. And a Catholic school in Goulburn said, OK, well, fine, we're closing down and we're sending all of the kids to the local state school. It took, what, 4 days, 5 days for the state government to say, OK, hands up, the federal government, OK, hands up, we're going to throw some money at this thing to keep the school open. So there's a very good reason why we've gotten to where we are. The state system just could not cope if the Catholic system...
And I'm not saying we should have no federal funding, quite clearly. What I'm saying is that let the states do the convoluted, on-the-ground, this school needs more than that school model, in that it's their schools after all. The private schools, they run their own show, really. I mean, what we're talking about here is 60-70% of the schools which are state schools, and to have Canberra get themselves politically in such a bind to the point where they never please anybody with the way that they do their funding model, to me just seems this perpetually ridiculous cycle.
Michael, why do you say that we can never get to a point where there can't be any federal funding? I mean, there are now record levels of government funding by the federal government into education, but the federal government don't operate a single school or employ a single teacher.
Yes.
It's another level of bureaucracy. Absolutely, without service delivery. And really, if we're wanting to see improved outcomes, as you mentioned, Tanvir, we for the investment, we are not seeing the outcomes that one would expect in terms of how we compare to, for example, Singapore. Our students are over a year behind in reading and 3 years behind in mathematics. So how do you drive competition? How do you drive better educational outcomes? Well, that is
on the ground level.
Absolutely. Between states, between schools as well.
Not from Canberra.
That socioeconomic number is interesting, Sam, isn't it? Because, say, for income tax, it's not like we get taxed according to what suburb we live in. So often you get a socioeconomic number for your suburb, but there's a lot of variation within suburbs. And this would happen, I know this happened in rural areas where often there'd be quite a low number socioeconomically, but then there'd be all these big private schools and boarding schools that would get extra funding because they were tied to that scale. So there's a lot of sort of inequities in that socioeconomic scale too sometimes.
Yeah, and you're dealing with a historical problem here. You know, this is... It's very easy to take a look at a problem from today's perspective and say, well, isn't it great, can't we just do this if we were recreating the wheel, from today? But we're not. This is a 100, 200-year-old system, and these areas have been built up or not been built up, and these schools have been built up or not been built up over 200 years. But I've got to say, if the Liberal Party at the next election want to take a policy that says we're out of education, as a former losing Labor candidate, that would do me no end of good. That would be fantastic.
Yeah, well, you're right, yeah. But see, again, I'm not saying they should get out. I'm not saying anyone should get out. But what I clearly said was that the Canberra effort has to be streamlined. And you end up with these models. We've seen it recently with Gonski. There were some very good ideas in the Gonski model, but that never really got the endorsement of the Parliament, let alone the public, fully. There's still debate about whether you need more money, less money. Labor tend to say, let's throw more money at anything. The Coalition tend to say, let's pull money back. What I'm saying is, let the states run their schools and let Canberra acknowledge that, as you've said, there's historical precedent to throw a lot of money at education, but make it simple. And from Canberra's point of view, every 14-year-old, doesn't matter who their parents are, how much money they're worth or what, is worth X dollars. Every 16-year-old's worth Y dollars. There's your cheque. You can take it to the private school, a bit like private health, and you pay the gap if you go to a private school.
You're going to ensure that schools in...
But you can get an extra buck.
No, you're not. No, because the states can deliver the funding.
But where are the states going to get this magical money tree?
Well, let's look at the GST redistribution then. I mean, I'm not saying that you leave the state funding model. What I'm saying in 40 seconds, when we got to do an editorial, is that you can open up this discussion about Canberra's role in the funding, and then if, indeed, the states say, well, hang on, we're going to need another $4 billion here to prop up Mount Druitt because Bellevue Hill's doing much better, well, OK, go back to Canberra, look at GST, look at stamp duty, look at all these big levers states have to play with. But like with anything, things are best delivered at the local level. And I don't know a big bureaucracy of white shirts in Canberra are best delivering education.
And whether it's Labor or Liberal, there is this problem of federal overreach. And look, we've just come off this sports scandal around the grants. That's an example, and I don't think it's limited to the ALP. I think the Liberal Party do it too, where you're getting federal money creeping into every sector. Regardless of what it is. So overall, I agree that it could be simplified. I think that the feds could pull back a little. And I think I'd add one other point, particularly in, I know Sydney and Melbourne, but it's creeping across the country. We have one of the most segregated educational systems in the world. I know Sydney has one of the most ethnically segregated educational systems in the world.
Particularly selective.
So this is a huge problem. It's getting more and more fragmented, our school system.
Well, part of the issue is that voters don't know who is to blame when it comes to educational outcomes. Right. So you've got federal and state government funding. Both say it's the other level of government that's at fault. And voters don't know who's telling the truth there. And because the blame game continuously being played, we don't see advancement in terms of educational outcomes. But there are so many things that could be improved. Michael, I love your idea about the voucher system, But at the moment, we do have a zoning system for schools, for government schools. And, you know, Tanvi, as you were saying, port barrelling absolutely does happen. I used to live in a very marginal seat in Victoria where our local government school had money thrown at it left, right and centre. It had great academic outcomes and everybody would try and move into the suburb to try and get their kids into that school. But what this creates is postcode inequality because other schools in safe, typically Labor seats, really did have terrible education outcomes, terrible academic outcomes.
And surely it's best then that the state government that tend to have 2 or 3 seats representing that rather than the one federal seat that those schools may be in, can deliver the funding that's required in the hotspots that need it. And if they need more money, well, let's talk through the federation process about how they can get that money. Now, that's not an easy discussion.
Well, you want to talk about unscrambling eggs. I mean, that's the greatest egg of all to unscramble. I mean, you've got, what, 87% of all taxes
but it's worth trying.
Of federal government.
Yeah, but it's worth trying.
But, Michael, that is happening in terms of needs-based funding that was introduced by the federal government in 2018. The problem is it's run by federal bureaucrats in Canberra. And, you know, in order to really address the needs, it needs to be happening at the local level where schools know their students know what the needs are.